The defendant told security and EMS that the blood in the bathroom was just from a heavy period and that she was not pregnant and has never been pregnant.
A former college student has been accused of killing her baby and throwing the body in a trash can. She's now set to face trial in July, and this comes after her defense had asked for a delay. Brianna Moore is facing some serious charges after the baby's body was discovered in a trash can inside of a dorm bathroom, leading to Moore's arrest. We're going to break down the latest developments in this case with former Palm Beach County State Attorney Dave Aronberg. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Just a heartbreaking case that we're now focusing upon, and it's one that has shaken the University of Tampa community. This is the case of Brianna Moore, a former college student who is accused of killing her newborn baby and then dumping the body into a trash can. Now, Moore is back in the news as she was the focus of a court hearing last week where a judge set a new trial date for the 19-year-old after she chose to waive her right to a speedy trial. We'll talk about that. Now, the death of this newborn girl has sparked outrage, heartache, as the details surrounding this incident, what allegedly happened, they have unfolded in the months since Moore's arrest back in October. And we're going to get into all of that. But first, I have to take you back to where this all began. So this story unfolded back on April 27th of last year when Moore's roommates at the University of Tampa's McKay Hall became alarmed. Why? Because they heard what sounded like a baby crying, and they apparently found blood on the bathroom floor and immediately contacted emergency services. But get this, when paramedics arrived, Moore allegedly denied that she was even pregnant, saying all the blood found in the bathroom was due to a heavy period. And this came up in a previous court hearing after Moore's arrest back in October, where a detective testified on what Moore allegedly told police while inside that bathroom.
The defendant told security and EMS that the blood in the bathroom was just from a heavy period and that she was not pregnant and has never been pregnant.
But despite her explanation that this was just routine and a menstrual cycle, paramedics were still understandably concerned, and they decided to do a follow-up check on Moore. But following that checkup, they actually left the scene, not suspecting that there had been any foul play. That's based on the reporting. However, reportedly, the following day, things took a much darker turn. Why? Because Moore's roommates apparently found a bloody towel inside of the trash can in their shared bathroom. So they called authorities again, and this baby's body was discovered in the trash can. And when Tampa police interviewed Moore, she didn't try to deny the pregnancy any longer. No, State Attorney Susie Lopez announced the details surrounding this discovery in a press conference back in October.
She admitted to giving birth. She told police that after giving birth in that bathroom, she held the baby tightly against her. And then, when the baby stopped crying, she wrapped that newborn baby girl in a towel and threw her away in a trash can.
So according to the arrest affidavit that was reviewed by the Tampa Bay Times, Moore told police, or apparently told police, that she thought the baby was dead when she placed it in the trash, but she didn't do this right away. No, she told police that she showered, she cleaned the newborn, placed her on the floor of her bedroom before falling asleep for an hour. Upon waking up, Moore found the baby still showed no signs of life, and at that point, she decided to wrap up the child in a towel and literally threw her away, disposing of her body in a trash can. And by the way, we checked out Brianna Moore on TruthFinder, the powerful background checker that we use for our stories, and we were able to find some relatives and addresses that she's associated with, but nothing appears under her criminal history. And by the way, Law&Crime, we partner with TruthFinder. We use it to get details on people involved in our stories, but even if you don't work in true crime, this can just be an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. I say that because it's one of the largest public record search services in the United States. And with a paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. So if you're interested right now, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. Just go to truthfinder.com/LC Sidebar. Now, while the details surrounding Moore's state of mind at the time are quite complex, there is one thing that we know for sure. Nowhere does it indicate in that affidavit that she ever sought medical assistance for the baby or notified authorities of the birth, which according to DA Lopez would have changed everything. She spoke to us about this in a previous Sidebar episode.
There are options, and we want people to know that there are options. In fact, the state of Florida just fairly recently expanded the safe haven laws. So someone has 30 days after giving birth to turn a baby in, to leave a baby at either a hospital or a fire station, no questions asked. The odd and sad irony here is Tampa General Hospital, which is our main hospital in Hillsborough County, is about 2 to 3 minutes by car from the University of Tampa, and there's a fire station right across the street. So Miss Moore had options. She chose not to exercise those options. She, in fact, denied being pregnant when asked the day before the baby was discovered, to the day that she had given birth. And this case is factually different than that cheerleader because we know that this baby lived. We know that this baby cried because her Miss Moore's roommates heard this baby cry. So this is not a situation where Miss Moore gave birth to a baby who was already deceased. She gave birth to a live, full-term, about 5.5-pound baby girl. And the actions that Miss Moore took immediately following this birth directly led to this baby's death.
That cheerleader case that she's referring to is that of Alexi Treviso, who was arrested also after allegedly giving birth in a bathroom. This time it was in a hospital before allegedly placing the newborn's baby into a trash can. So you see the parallels there. We'll talk about it. I want to bring in friend of the show, Dave Aronberg, to talk more about this. Attorney, former state's attorney for Florida's Palm Beach County. Dave, thanks so much for coming on. Really, really appreciate it. So talk to me about what are the key legal challenges in a case like this? Because you have a defendant who is accused of quite a heinous crime. She's charged with aggravated manslaughter. But there are also these complex elements of denial, mental health, everything coming into play.
This is a real tragic case, and for prosecutors, it's important to be able to prove that the baby was born alive. But that seems to be relatively easy because you have multiple witnesses who said they heard the baby crying. And so the baby was born alive. The baby was crying for a while, and then it stopped. But then the medical examiner's testimony is really important to determine the cause of death, because when you have a newborn baby, there could be different causes of death that perhaps doesn't implicate the mother here. But here, the medical examiner says that it was asphyxiation. So the baby essentially was choked to death, and it would take only, at minimum, 45 seconds for it to happen. And then you have conflicting testimony by the defendant. So the case is strong enough that you saw the state attorney, my former counterpart, Susie Lopez, go out front and say, this is a case that we are pursuing. We're going to do justice here, because it is controversial when you have a situation like this, because you have a defendant who can be sympathetic for some people. You see her and you see she's only 19 years old. She looks bewildered by the whole process. And yet, though, her series of lies that she told to others, the inconsistencies in her statements, the medical examiner, and the fact this was an innocent baby who lost her life, all mean that this is why this case is being prosecuted.
And I'm going to go into the autopsy in a little bit, but why aggravated manslaughter? What is aggravated manslaughter? How do you prove aggravated manslaughter?
Aggravated manslaughter is easier to prove than murder, but it is still a first-degree felony punishable by up to 30 years in prison. Now, that's the maximum. For someone like this who has no priors, she would get, I would suspect, a lot less. But it's still a serious crime. You have to prove that, first, the victim died. We know that it was culpable negligence that caused the victim's death, essentially such recklessness that death would happen. For example, it's like shooting in the air on New Year's Eve and the bullet comes down to kill someone. You didn't intend to kill someone, but your reckless actions meant that death was very likely. Also, if the victim was a child and the defendant's neglect caused the victim's death, that's an important element. So you have a bunch of elements here that raise it up to this first-degree felony, even though they're not charging her with an intentional death, but rather the fact that she acted so recklessly. So they don't even have to prove that she wanted to kill the baby, which means it's much easier for prosecutors. Just that when you even admit to holding the baby really, really close, and then the baby doesn't make a noise anymore, and then you go to bed, well, that would be aggravated manslaughter. And that's why it's charged here. Yeah. You could have charged murder here and gotten up to life in prison, but they took a step less to make it easier to prove.
And of course, the idea would be, if you knew you were pregnant, you should have gotten the proper care, not have done this on your own. That obviously doesn't help with her, but we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of particularly the cause of death. I want to get back to that. But in cases like this, where you have a defendant who may have been in a state of denial, right? We're assuming that she was perfectly understanding what was going on. If you have somebody who's in a state of denial, how does the prosecution balance presenting evidence of guilt with maybe the need to understand the defendant's mental state, who's someone who's particularly young as well.
You take that into consideration because the worst thing for a prosecutor is jury nullification, where you have sympathetic juror or jurors who say, you know, this 19-year-old was bewildered, didn't know what she was doing, and they just cannot envision putting her in prison, so they just find her not guilty. It's a prosecutor's worst nightmare in every case because jurors are supposed to follow the evidence and the law and put sympathies aside. So you have to deal with that. But I think that's one reason why they're charging manslaughter instead of murder. So they don't have to charge mens rea. They don't have to show that she intended to kill the baby, but just acted recklessly. And they're also going to focus on the baby as opposed to the defendant. It is, though, a minefield because jurors are humans, too. They may have daughters themselves. They may fear and put themselves in the daughter's shoes that this could happen to them. And who knows what the verdict will be. So that's why these cases will often end up in a settlement, a plea deal in advance, because this defendant is not going to prison for 30 years anyway. She's not going to get the maximum sentence based on her lack of track record and her age.
Now, Dave, something I mentioned before is that this case is unfortunately very eerily similar to that one out of New Mexico, the case of Alexi Treviso. What are some of the parallels that stick out to you between the two cases? Because remember, Alexi Treviso, she's being charged with first-degree murder in that case. So why do you have that discrepancy? What do you see the similarities between the two cases?
Well, you know the similarities. You have individuals who denied they were pregnant and then tried to apparently end the pregnancy after the baby was born. Really tragic cases. One difference, though, is that the Treviso case, the cheerleader case, this individual allegedly killed the baby in the hospital. I mean, talk about not taking advantage of the opportunity of saving the baby by alerting healthcare officials who are just in the same room. I mean, we're talking about being in a hospital and you chose to hide your baby, go in a bathroom and kill this child. I mean, that's different than when you're a bewildered college student, 19 years old, you've been denying your pregnancy, you go into the bathroom and something terrible happens. Now, both are being prosecuted, but you can see why one is being prosecuted for murder and the other one for manslaughter, why one could be put in prison the rest of her life while the other could get out while she's relatively young.
Now, you mentioned State Attorney Ms. Lopez. She mentioned something else I wanted to ask you about. She mentioned the Florida safe haven laws, which allows, my understanding, allows people to surrender their newborns if they feel they cannot, take care of them. When you think about that, how significant is it that Moore didn't take advantage of that option or didn't allegedly take advantage of that option? What role do these laws play in preventing, tragedies like this? Because at the end of the day, you have a baby who is dead. It becomes a question of how the baby is dead and who might be responsible. But talk to us about the safe haven laws and what role they could have played here.
The safe haven laws passed with bipartisan support, and they provide an avenue for someone in a situation like this to drop off a baby at a fire station, at a hospital. There are signs outside to encourage people to do that, but the word doesn't always get out. You have a 19-year-old college student who's from Mississippi, not from Florida, who likely was unaware of these laws. So the prosecution is going to say, look at these laws. It would have been too easy to save this baby's life. She did below the minimum. She didn't even alert healthcare officials. She could have taken the baby elsewhere. It wasn't like she had nowhere else to turn. She had many avenues where she could have saved this child's life. On the other hand, the defense will try to point out that she's not from Florida. She's not exactly familiar with the law. She was a biology major. It's not like a pre-law major. So that's going to be tougher for them.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think that the safe haven laws play a role in a trial? Because I wonder, the defense could say that, she's not aware of that, but if she's pregnant and she's for 9 months, she could have been thinking about what to do, and maybe I should look what the laws are in Florida and what I can do. I guess that would be the counter argument. So A, do you really think it would play a role in an upcoming trial? And B, do you think that defense would work?
I think it'll play a role in that the prosecutors will use it. You saw a preview of it from the state attorney, Susie Lopez.
Yeah.
As far as a strategy, the defense lawyers are going to say that she was in denial. She was just a young person who was confused, who from another state didn't know about these laws and acted perhaps rashly, but didn't have the intent to kill someone. Now, that's why this charge of aggravated manslaughter is so important, because you don't need intent, but you still have to prove recklessness.
Yeah.
So the defense is going to try to say this is what she was doing, a 19-year-old girl who's a simpleton. It wasn't reckless. It was just a mistake.
That's what I wanted to get into next, because the autopsy that was performed on Moore's baby revealed these devastating findings. So the infant died, allegedly, from asphyxia caused by compression of the torso. Essentially, we're talking about suffocation. And this child also had several broken ribs, hemorrhaging from the lungs. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. She was arrested on October 18th. That was nearly 6 months after the baby's death, I imagine. And again, she was charged with aggravated manslaughter of a child, child neglect with great bodily harm, failure to report the death to a medical or law enforcement with the intent to conceal, and unlawfully holding or moving a dead human in unapproved conditions. She's pleaded not guilty to those charges. But Dave, it feels like a lot of this is going to come down to the autopsy findings. So how would Brianna Moore dispute those findings? Because I imagine an argument could be, yes, she was pregnant. Yes, she panicked. Yes, she gave birth to this child. The baby was alive. The baby was screaming, but the baby died. It was an accident. She didn't, if you don't take proper care of the baby or there's complications, babies die all the time in childbirth. It was nothing she did. She didn't suffocate the child, but the baby died nonetheless. Having said that, those autopsy findings would suggest otherwise. How do you dispute those autopsy findings?
The defendant has a problem here because she spoke freely without a lawyer to investigators, and she admitted that she held the baby really tight until the baby stopped crying. And so it's very easy to extrapolate that when she held the baby really tight, by her own admission, that's what broke the baby's ribs, and that's what led to the asphyxiation. She held the baby. It's her own words. Plus, she was inconsistent with her statements. She said different things at different times, and she lied throughout the process by denying she even was pregnant. And so they're getting her on not just the manslaughter, but other crimes like the disposal of the baby, other things. So this is an uphill battle for the defense. I think the defense's best argument is, as you say, that she didn't know, she didn't try to harm the baby. She never had been through this situation before. She was in denial, and she made a mistake, which doesn't rise to the level of aggravated manslaughter. Maybe that's involuntary manslaughter, a lesser crime, but the top crime here is punishable by up to 30 years. And I would think that defense lawyers are trying to go in there thinking they could get something less, or perhaps jury nullification by getting some sympathy from the jurors.
But do they call their own expert to say, hey, this hemorrhaging, these ribs, the asphyxiation, none of this is caused by Brianna Moore's doing. It's something through the act of childbirth. I mean, that feels, again, to be an uphill battle, but is it just going to be a dispute among experts? They call in their own medical professional?
That's what they want. They will definitely call in their own expert, because I doubt that the defendant will take the stand herself. But instead, they'll have an expert to try to sow doubt, to try to say, yeah, it's very possible that this was just a mistake, that what she did was not to harm the baby, or at least not in her mind, because this baby died from this other cause, or there's something else that could have contributed to it. If you can put that doubt in jurors' minds, that's reasonable doubt, and that is a hung jury or possibly an acquittal. So I do expect the defense will try to make this into a battle of experts, and ultimately the jurors will have to decide which one they believe.
Let me ask you this. So according to the court records, this trial was supposed to begin in February, but during her latest court appearance from last Thursday, her attorney requested a continuance on the case. That was granted. According to local affiliate WFLA, the judge set a new trial date for July, and during that hearing, State Attorney Lopez reaffirmed the thoroughness of the investigation due to what is the unique aspect and unique nature of this case. But she did tell us a little bit about what made this case so different for her when we last spoke with her. Take a listen.
I go to most homicide scenes, but it's very rare that we have a child involved, especially a newborn. And I stood there outside of the dorm at the University of Tampa, and I saw a bag that I knew, from what I had learned, contained a full-term newborn baby girl. And so it was hard because in the weeks that followed, I had people walk up to me at Publix, our grocery store, in the courthouse, in my own office, who said, I would have taken that baby girl without question and raised her as my own. And so it was definitely very emotional to know that this woman made the choices that she did, and that her actions contributed directly to that newborn baby girl's death.
But Dave, I want to go back to this question about what is the significance of Brianna Moore waiving her right to a speedy trial asking for a continuance. What's the strategy here?
It actually happens more often than not that a defendant will waive their right to a speedy trial. They want to gather all the evidence they can, and they believe that the longer a case goes on, then the memories from witnesses will fade, perhaps evidence will spoil, the passions of a community will cool. Remember, this case really drew a lot of anger in the community. So there are a lot of reasons. Also, perhaps they could put a little pressure on prosecutors to settle this case. Oh, this case is going on for so long, taxpayer dollars. So there are a lot of strategies behind delaying the case further. It is actually pretty common to do so. Now, it's interesting to note that this prosecutor here, State Attorney Susie Lopez, she was appointed by Governor DeSantis to replace the elected state attorney, Andrew Warren, who was seen as a criminal justice reformer, a progressive prosecutor. The former prosecutor was removed and replaced by Susie Lopez, who then just won her election over Andrew Warren. So that puts into context that she's coming at this with a very pro-law and order, pro-prosecution, tough on crime bent, much more so than her predecessor. So that's one reason why they're going to the mat on this, and she's talking out, speaking why we need to be tough. This is a different approach than perhaps the person she removed would have had.
Let's go to a trial. What would be the challenges when it comes to selecting a jury, both for the prosecution and the defense?
You want to remove people who are going to act with emotion, with sympathy, as opposed to following the evidence and the law. If you follow the evidence and the law, this should lead to a conviction. Now, that's assuming the expert for the defense doesn't blow everyone away. If that happens, then reasonable doubt. But I do think that the challenge is to find people who can set aside emotion, because if you're a parent, I mean, you can imagine how it's hard not to put yourself in those shoes. But whose shoes are you going to put yourself in? The baby's or the 19-year-old daughter? So we'll see. But also, you want to remove people who have developed their own opinions about the case in advance and can't move off them. It's okay that you've heard about this case. I think everyone in the Tampa area has heard about this case. You have to be able to set aside your biases and just follow the evidence and the law.
It's a tragic case. It can be a complicated case. You're dealing with the loss of a life. You're dealing with the idea of what would have happened if she just sought out the support that she needed, and maybe she did, and maybe that evidence will come out. We'll see. But it's just trying to make sense of what happened here can be quite difficult. And for Brianna Moore, she's currently being held at the Falkenberg Road Jail in Hillsborough County on a $262,500 bond. And Dave, it's our understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, but if convicted on all of the charges, she could face up to 55 years behind bars. You talked about Susie Lopez's tough stance on these kinds of crimes, or tough stance on crime. Do you think that, going back to something you mentioned earlier, if she is convicted, do you think that's what prosecutors would be seeking? Essentially, her spending maybe the good portion of her life, or potentially the rest of her life, behind bars. I mean, is that appropriate in these kinds of circumstances? And do you think the court would accept that?
Well, Susie Lopez, I know her. She is a tough on crime prosecutor. She ran on that. She was appointed to that office by Governor DeSantis for that purpose. And Governor DeSantis is very anti-abortion. He called himself very pro-life. And so this is something that could play into the decision-making of the prosecutors. Now, on the other hand, this defendant is going to get some sympathy from the community. And she has no prior crimes, no rap sheet. She's only 19 years old. So I think that if she's found guilty in all these crimes, she'll get a lot less than maximum. I do not anticipate she'll spend 55 years in prison. And this could still end up in a plea deal. Maybe that's one of the reasons why her lawyers, the defendant's lawyers, wanted to extend this further to continue the negotiations with the prosecution. But they're dealing with someone in the state attorney who is probably not going to be as willing to give her a break as the state attorney's predecessor.
Dave Aronberg, good seeing you. Thanks so much for coming on, my friend. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.